Great to see you again. In this super important lesson, we're diving into two essential ways of thinking, top-down and bottom-up. First, we'll explore how these approaches apply to software development. Then, I'll show you how you can start practicing them right now. Yes, even when you're just reading and writing expressions. During my long teaching career, I noticed that most struggling students suffer from something I call the Python syndrome. When faced with an assignment problem, they try to tackle it all at once, just like a python swallowing a rabbit whole. But unless the problem is extremely simple, this approach rarely works. So, what does work? One way to approach the problem is to think about it in a top-down manner, where we break the problem into smaller parts, each easier to solve than the original. For example, if we're talking about building a software system, we would decompose it into components. For example, a web application might be broken down into two main parts, the front end and the back end. We can then break this down further into their subcomponents. This process continues until each component is simple enough to implement. For implementing and testing, we might use the opposite, bottom-up approach, whereby we implement and test the simplest components, then combine them into larger components and test those, and continue this process until the whole system is built and tested. Note that the two approaches are complementary. We use the top-down approach to decompose the system and the bottom-up approach to build and test it. Now, let's see how this approach works with expressions. Suppose we need to compute the given mathematical expression. To break this problem down using the top-down approach, we simply ask ourselves, what operation is performed last? Then we translate that into code. In this case, the last operation is division, which corresponds to the slash operator. As you see, I've added a pair of parentheses for each operand. In the following steps, I'll fill in what goes inside those parentheses. If the last operation had been a function, like in the second example, I would simply write the name of the function, add parentheses, and leave the arguments to be filled in during the next steps. Now, let's look at the remaining steps for the first example. At each step, I pick a set of parentheses to fill in and ask, what is the last operation inside this part? Take a moment to pause the video and work through these steps to understand them. Then, complete the second example as an exercise. When writing expressions, it's easy to get tripped up by parentheses. But this approach guarantees that your parentheses will always remain balanced. Now, you probably noticed that this process was mostly top-down. What about the bottom-up approach? Well, since we didn't build the parts of the expression separately, the bottom-up approach isn't as apparent here as it was in the software system example. Students who struggle with writing expressions often rely on a purely bottom-up approach, where they gradually build the expression starting from the simplest computations. However, experience shows that this makes it very difficult to construct a complex expression correctly, usually because the parentheses become unbalanced. If you still want to use this approach, here is a systematic way to handle it while keeping the parentheses balanced. As we discussed, great programmers write code that almost explains itself. It's easy to read and easy to work with. For this reason, they tend to avoid writing overly complicated expressions. Later in the course, we'll explore several tools to help achieve this. That said, I believe that writing complex expressions, like the one shown, can be incredibly valuable when you're just starting out. Why? Because unless you approach writing such an expression systematically, it's tough to get it right. And that makes it an excellent exercise in systematic top-down thinking. Sooner or later, you'll encounter a complicated expression written either by someone trying to appear smart or someone who didn't know any better. The key to understanding even the most complex expression is identifying where each pair of parentheses begins and ends. Start with the innermost parenthesis and work your way outwards. In summary, you've learned about the top-down and bottom-up approaches, both for building a software system and for reading and writing expressions. Now it's time to put these concepts into practice with the exercises I'll introduce in the next lesson.